Whether intended or not, one of the most consequential results of the internet was the development of micro-communities and fandoms. People once isolated were now no more than a few clicks away from the like-minded people who shared their interests, resulting in countless groups for virtually any topic. This includes people interested in speedrunning. What began as a largely solitary journey has become increasingly community-focused. As they've become more developed, these communities have begun to resemble the real world, with governing bodies creating rules for everyone to follow. And just like the real world, different communities approach governing more fairly or more tyrannically than others, resulting in wildly different structures. This is the politics of speedrunning. The beginning of speedrunning is not too dissimilar from how society began. In political philosophy, the state of nature is how people lived before they were organized into societies. Without rules to govern, individuals would be free to act as self-righteously or immoral as they pleased, since there were no laws in place to dissuade this behavior. In many ways, the earliest days of speedrunning existed in this state of anarchy. The first example comes from the 1980 Atari 2600 game Dragster. While hardly more than a simple drag racing game, its origins as a speedrun come from Activision itself. The game's manual asks players to send in a picture of any time under 6 seconds, while the back of the box states, the world record is 5.61 seconds. If you break that, it will make news. With incentive lacking accountability, only one outcome was ever possible. A man by the name of Todd Rogers would claim a time of 5.51 seconds in 1982, and for the next 36 years, people just believed him. To mark 30 years since the record had been set, Guinness World Records would honor him for the longest standing video game record, only for the time to be proven impossible 6 years later. The absence of structure to speedrunning would continue into the 90s, except becoming even more apparent. Nintendo Power was a video game magazine published by Nintendo of America and running from 1988 to 2012. Among the news and strategies, readers could find a section on high scores. Much like how Activision ran its Dragster Club, Nintendo Power asked true video wizards to send in a picture of their scores for them to be published in the next issue. While the challenges were usually high score related, speedruns frequently made their way in. In the very first issue of the magazine, times would be listed for Excitebike, a 1984 NES title designed by Shigeru Miyamoto. The fastest time would be a 54.43 second time, credited to Tom Williams. Congrats, Tom! Excitebike would be featured again in the next 3 issues, with the time going as low as 50.05 seconds. Now, the biggest issue with this era of speedrunning is that it's impossible to know if any of these times are real. The prevalence of cheaters mixed with the lack of proof leads to even the most plausible times still being questionable. As the decade progressed though, things began to change and society began to emerge. A small decision made by the developers of Doom single-handedly pushed speedrunning further than anything before. Gameplay demos are a recording of every input a player makes during a segment. This lets the game play back exactly what a player did, allowing for a way to verify a claim time without the need for video proof. A detail that may seem insignificant at first but was truly essential is the size of the file. In an age of dial-up, internet speeds were pretty miserable. A full video could take hours to download, making it too impractical to be standard. The small size of demos allowed them to be easily uploaded to the internet so that others could download the file and play back the segment on their computer. Now with the ability to connect and share, communities began to form around Doom speedruns. The earliest site for this was CompeteN, which was dedicated to challenge runs of Doom, with runners being ranked based on the speed they completed it. If Doom began to lay the foundation for society, Quake expanded that beyond what was previously conceived. At the base level, Quake was not too different from Doom. Having been developed by the same studios, Quake would also include gameplay demos and an in-game timer, allowing for continued verifiable competition. It was the community that formed around Quake though which pushed speedrunning past its previous bounds. A runner by the name of Radix would create NightmareSpeedruns.com, a website dedicated solely to speedruns of Quake on the Nightmare difficulty. Perhaps the most important thing to come out of this website was Quake Done Quick. Clocking in at 1949, Quake Done Quick was revolutionary. Prior to this point, speedrunning was largely isolated to beating a single level. Quake Done Quick would beat the entire game. The run was segmented by Radix and 3 other runners. This run would go on to leave a lasting impact on the speedrunning community as a whole, with the charity marathon Games Done Quick paying homage to it. Nightmare Speed Demos would eventually merge with other Quake speedrunning websites to form Speed Demos Archive. While the site would remain Quake exclusive for several years, Radix would open it up to other games in 2004, as by this point he had joined the Metroid Prime community and wanted somewhere to host his run. For the next several years, SDA would become the center of the speedrunning world. It provided a place for all sorts of communities to host the records for all to see. It also served as a period of tyranny in speedrunning. SDA was heavily centralized. It had a general set of rules that each run must follow in order to be verified. While this sounds great at first, it was less than stellar in practice. Many of these rules were for quality assurance. SDA did not want to host runs that were of subpar quality, so it would often reject runs that did not meet a certain standard. This did a lot to shape the culture of speedrunning at the time, making it more gatekept, as runners would often not upload times until they were completely satisfied with them, so it would be less likely that they would be rejected. It also placed much of the attention on world record culture, as it generally hosted just the world record for the game, rather than serving as a leaderboard. While some rules made sense, other rules were more confusing. The two most head-scratching were probably the ones related to dying and going out of bounds. SDA would initially ban both death abuse and out of bounds tricks from runs on the grounds that it didn't look good. While these rules would be loosened over time, other increasingly arbitrary ones would make their way into the rulebook. For games in which dying significantly lowers the final time and changes the strategy throughout the run, runs with deaths can be categorized separately. For games that let players save and reload anywhere, a half-second penalty is added for each manual save. If a run is over 3 hours long, the minimum improvement allowed is 1 minute because seconds are less significant past the 3-hour mark. Of course, SDA was not the only website dedicated to speedrunning in the 2000s. In fact, many communities had their own sites dedicated to specific games and series. Even once SDA opened to all games, communities like Mario Kart 64 and GoldenEye would opt to continue hosting their own sites. This came with one distinct advantage: autonomy. In political theory, few things have been as influential in recent centuries than the concept of autonomy. Autonomy is the act of self-governance, the ability for a group to make rules for themselves, rather than having a higher authority dictate how they can live. There's perhaps no better example of the importance of autonomy and self-governance than Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam. The story of Vietnam in the early 20th century is one of toiling under colonial rule. The 19th century had seen Vietnam fall under the control of the French, while the 20th century would be characterized by the struggle of autonomy. By 1919, World War I had come to a close and negotiations were underway, with America's 28th President Woodrow Wilson playing a key role. The Paris Peace Conference saw Wilson work to enact his 14 points. Of the values he laid out, self-determination was key among them. In the aftermath of the war, Wilson wanted autonomy for the people of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. These principles resonated deeply with Ho Chi Minh, who sought counsel from Wilson to ask for America's help in escaping French colonial rule in the name of self-determination. Wilson ignored him. Nearly 30 years and another world war later, Ho Chi Minh found himself in the same spot. While the rest of the world was beginning to undergo decolonization, Vietnam watched as the French tried to reinstate their influence over the nation. Now, the president of a government recognized by none, Ho Chi Minh would once again find himself reaching out to a sitting president. He wrote to President Truman, stressing Vietnam's effort in assisting the US during the war and recalling America's Atlantic Charter, which all too cleanly stated that every nation had the right to choose which form of government they should live under. In total, 8 letters were written and no one responded. Rather than upholding the values the United States claimed to hold, Truman actively worked to embolden the French, trading beliefs for comfort. So in the end, Ho Chi Minh did it himself. First, the Vietnamese would kick out the French, then it became the first nation to win a war against the United States. While he wouldn't live to see foreign boots leave Vietnamese soil, Ho Chi Minh's dreams would be achieved. Much like Ho Chi Minh, the belief that a community can decide what is best for itself would go on to shape speedrunning. As speedrunning entered the age of live streaming, it needed to adapt. More and more people were getting into it, and they didn't hold the same notions of runners of previous generations. They wanted to run their games the way they saw fit, with SDA increasingly not making the cut. Communities no longer wish for their rules to be defined by a self-defined group of outsiders claiming to be physically, mentally, and emotionally superior. The tipping point would come in 2014 with Speedrun.com going live. Speedrun.com functioned as a leaderboard website where runs would be submitted for any game and then displayed for all to see. Rather than having a centralized group of verifiers deciding the legitimacy of a game they've never run, verifiers would be game-specific, with communities being able to decide on who verified runs. It also didn't dictate what was allowed to be done in runs, leaving decisions regarding rules up to communities as well. All of this represented an opportunity for autonomy and the ability for communities to govern themselves as they saw fit. Of course, this also meant virtually every community would govern themselves differently. When it comes to managing a speedrunning community, there are 3 main aspects that come into play: verifying, moderating, and rule setting. Verifying is the most straightforward of the roles. When a run is submitted, the community must review it and determine if it follows the rules, after which it will be instated onto the boards. While different communities have different standards of quality for what they allow on the boards, the role of verifying is largely consistent between communities. Moderating is generally more community-oriented. Much like any society, speedrunning communities have discussions to be held, news that must be delivered, problems to resolve, rules that must be followed, and punishments to be carried out. The role of moderating is to ensure that the community runs smoothly. Rules and how they're decided is where the biggest difference between communities arise. Each game has a unique circumstance and thus must tailor the rules to fit the needs of the community. Just like the real world though, speedrunning is characterized by the vastly different structures for how these decisions are made. This has led to anything from democracies holding community-wide votes to dictators aggressively ruling over their games and making decisions with little regard for the thoughts of others. As one of the largest speedrunning communities, Minecraft has also developed an extensive political structure. In a game well known for its cheating scandals, moderation and verification are separate teams working jointly. Runners can apply by filling out a form asking about their experience and interest in the position, with roles being rewarded to trusted applicants as agreed upon by the mod team. In function, the moderates serve as the legislative body, while the verifiers are the enforcers. At first glance, the way Minecraft approaches policy decisions doesn't seem that unusual. Every so often, polls will be sent in the public Discord to survey the community's opinion. While the winning option does not necessarily guarantee that option will be selected, it's used to inform the moderation team of how the society as a whole wishes to progress, allowing them to make decisions accordingly. The more unique quirk of rule setting in Minecraft happens behind closed invites though. In addition to the normal public Discord, there's an invite-only server simply titled Minecraft Speedrun Discussion, but more commonly referred to as the Top Runner Discord. Runners with the time under a category-specific threshold are allowed to join this server, providing them with more direct access to the moderation team to voice their concerns. The Top Runner Discord was made to address one of the most controversial periods of Minecraft speedrunning. As the community became more advanced, increasingly complicated ways of locating the stronghold were developed, oftentimes requiring the use of a calculator or a table of values to solve. This would in turn become a contentious debate over the validity of speedruns that use calculators, as in the most literal sense of the words, they were speedruns assisted by tools. Many runners believed that this had blurred the line between RTA and TAS too much, and that their use in speedruns should be prohibited. It seemed like the end was reached when the community was polled and the results showed calculators winning, but this left a mess to clean up. One firm opponent to calculators being allowed was Feinberg. Feinberg has long been one of Minecraft speedrunning's largest streamers and fastest runners. He would turn on his stream during this ordeal and unload his thoughts.
As a community, for us to have a world record run with a program playing the game for you, that's the only reason why until this situation got fixed. It's because he got the world record. We don't need to let it get to that point again. We had the same issue 6 months ago. The mods just need to do something.
Feinberg stressed how most of the mods at the time were either not active or they were not high-level runners. This made them poorly equipped for making decisions that affected the nature of speedrunning at world record contention. He also called out the mods for complacency, saying that problems were never addressed preemptively, but rather only when they could no longer be ignored. The fallout from this stream was immediate and would fundamentally change the structure of Minecraft speedrunning. It was initially met with hostility from much of the mod team. Most took what Feinberg had said personally and were unable to see anything but negativity towards an already thankless job. A minority of the mod team was in agreement with the sentiment of Feinberg's message, but they would push for changes to the way issues were approached. Part of this was changing the members of the mod team. Over time, more top-level runners would begin to find their way into positions, including Feinberg, but even this was not without incident. While other top runners would be welcomed with open arms, some moderators continued to harbor resentment towards Feinberg, leading to him not being offered a position until nearly a year after his rant. Perhaps more importantly though, a separate Discord would be set up exclusively for top runners to be more in the ear of moderators. This increased access has manifested itself in different ways. When the moderators go to survey the community for a policy change, results are divided between the community and the top runners. Oftentimes, all parties will agree and the result will reflect that accurately, but when the top runners and the rest of the community disagree, this structure forces moderators to choose between the two. A recent example of this can be seen in a poll conducted about texture pack rules. The poll begins by asking runners about whether old versions of Minecraft should be allowed to use the modern netherrack texture, with both the populace and the elite overwhelmingly in agreement that it should. After this, there are only 2 other textures where both sides are in agreement. In total, the general server voted in favor of 15 of the options, while the top runners were only in favor of 2 options and apathetic to another 5. On issues where both sides were in favor or one group had a preference and the other did not, the mod team had a straightforward decision. There were several results where the sides disagreed though, forcing a choice to be made, and it often favored the top runners. In the case of the health, hunger, and XP bar, the mod team opted to not allow texture changes, aligning with the desires of the top runners. The moderators would break with the top runners in regards to GUI color changes, but even this was only if it was a solid color or a gradient. In the end though, textures are just cosmetic changes. Outside of X-ray or high visibility packs, they don't have a pronounced impact on gameplay. There have been other times though where changes have been made with only the top runners being consulted. A poll was conducted in the top runner Discord over whether the mod's standard setting should be allowed. Standard setting makes it so that each time a runner joins a world, their settings are changed back to default. While this is more a quality of life adjustment than a truly game-changing mod, it still has an effect on the game. The results of the poll would find top runners to be overwhelmingly in favor of the mod being allowed, and a short bit later, it was legalized for runs. While it's likely that the community as a whole would approve its inclusion, the decision was made without the inclusion of the public Discord in the discourse. In this respect, Minecraft has chosen to govern itself as a meritocracy. Within a meritocracy, power is allocated based on ability. The more skilled a person is, the more of a say they have. While everyone in the community has a voice in the system, the voices of those with the fastest times are provided with the loudest microphones. This stands in contrast to speedrunning's other preeminent game. At this point, Super Mario 64 is a decades established scene. Of all the ways to describe SM64, rapid change is not one of them. The main role of moderators is to verify runs and manage the community Discord. The rules are largely established, and there are rarely times when change needs to be made. In this respect, moderators more closely resemble a group of volunteers than members of a government. Community members interested in moderating typically reach out to express their interest. If there are slots to be filled and the person is well respected in the community, they will be accepted onto the team. The primary responsibility is maintaining the leaderboards. In a game as popular as Super Mario 64, it doesn't require much slacking for a backlog of runs in need of verification to pile up. This makes it essential for each mod to keep up to date with the runs they need to verify, so as to not place an unfair burden onto other members of the team. While rule changes and policy adjustments are not the norm for Super Mario 64, they still arise from time to time. In February 2018, Cheese was on the run of his life. After losing time on the first split of the game, Cheese would go on to save time in 13 of the next 16 splits. He would enter Tippy nearly a minute ahead. Even after 2 messy splits, he would enter Bowser in the Sky half a minute ahead, and the first 138 still firmly attainable. When he first entered the pipe, it was as if time froze. The stream had been dropping frames every so often the entire run. He would hit the first throw, and then midway through the second throw, what happened became a bit of a mystery. Over the last 40 seconds of the run, there were 11 frames of gameplay. It couldn't be seen, but Cheese would miss a throw. Despite this, the run would still be a world record. This left the moderation team in a difficult position. No one thought Cheese had cheated. He was too good, too well respected, and the way it was done was too obvious. That said, standards needed to be upheld, especially for a world record run. A video of similar quality by a less known runner would probably not be accepted. A vote between the mod team was held, and it found that roughly half wanted the run to be verified, and another half did not. Without a clear preference, a compromise would be made. A new variable would be added to the leaderboards: verified. If a run is uploaded and no issues are found, it will be verified like normal. But for runs like Cheese, where cheating is not suspected but cannot be outright denied, they would be labeled as not verified. This allowed Cheese's run to be on the leaderboards, but it would not be verified. While this was a discussion made exclusively by the mods, that is not exclusively how SM64 makes decisions. Frame walking is arguably the most controversial trick in SM64 history. It had been known for years with little attention being paid to it, but all that changed at PACE 2019. During a 120-star race, Seglemic would change controllers in the middle of Jolly Roger Bay, changing from an N64 controller to a box and nunchuck. Frame walking requires the player to mash between analog up and neutral position within a small frame window repeatedly. By using a box, Seglemic was able to map analog up to a button, making it much easier to mash. This opened a tidal wave of players remapping their controllers to make frame walking easier, which rubbed other runners the wrong way. For a while, the moderation team chose to not act. In a community as stable as SM64, the hope was that the issue would guide itself to resolution. Instead, frame walking's detractors would grow louder, and the problem could no longer be ignored. Rather than simply making a rule, the team started by fielding opinions from the community. Eventually, these arguments would be compiled into a document and put to a vote for the community, with the winning result being to allow remapping as long as it was consistent throughout the run. In many respects, Super Mario 64 doesn't conform to any form of government being practiced. For the most part, it's reached a point where it can run on autopilot. The systems work as intended, so change is not needed. The role of the moderation team is less about governance and more closely resembling that of a bureaucracy, keeping the machine running. When a community-defining decision needs to be made, the structure of how to go about it is less defined. Not all communities are just a single game though. When browsing speedrun.com, you have the option to sort by both games and by series. Series are a grouping of all the games released under a certain title or franchise, such as The Legend of Zelda or Mario Kart. While most of these series don't operate as a single group, some do, which presents its own unique issues. Harry Potter is one of the most recognizable brands in the world. It also came out at a time where basically every movie and TV show had a tie-in video game. Not only was Harry Potter part of this trend, it epitomized it. For just the 8 films, there are 23 games, with spin-offs only adding to this number. These games break down into a few smaller communities, based primarily on platform, with PC, PS1, 6th generation consoles, handhelds, LEGO, and Hogwarts Legacy each being their own community. While these lines are not rigid and overlap exists, each is self-governing. Of all these communities, PC Harry Potter Speedrunning and the 9 games that make it up are the largest communities. PC Harry Potter has a unique political structure in that it more closely resembles governments found in the real world. While the leaders of most communities are appointed, HP approaches it differently. Every 6 months, elections are held for the role of prefect and for a spot on the Wizengamot, each of which can be held for a year. Since there's no maximum number of seats, candidates are not elected over one another, but simply run on their own individual merit. In order to be elected, a person must win a simple majority of votes cast by runners with a valid run on speedrun.com. This allows for the entire community to have a say, even if they do not run a specific game. The role of a prefect is to oversee the moderation of the community and maintain the Discord, while the Wizengamot is in charge of maintaining the leaderboards and deciding on rule changes following a community discussion. For smaller policy changes, the Wizengamot may choose to decide on their own, but more meaningful issues may be put to vote for the community as a whole. Since the Wizengamot are in charge of the boards and the prefects maintain the community votes require cooperation between both groups to be facilitated. The complexities arise when factoring in the fact that it isn't just one game that needs to be moderated, but 9. For help with this, members of the Wizengamot must be elected specifically for the games they wish to moderate, rather than simply being elected for all of them. This helps to ensure quality control, as for instance, it sets up the possibility that someone could be elected for Chamber of Secrets, while losing the Prisoner of Azkaban election if the community believes they are not qualified for both. While the entirety of the Wizengamot has a say in policy changes, a greater emphasis is placed on the moderators for the game in question to express their thoughts, while still showing respect for the members that are most ingrained in the game. As a whole, Harry Potter speedrunning is a uniquely democratic structure. The systems in place mirror ones found in many Western democracies, complete with organized divisions of power and elections. It also showcases a unique quirk of how speedrun.com is set up. While each game has their own team, some series also have their overall moderators. Series mods are appointed by speedrun.com itself, rather than by an individual community. Since games need to be approved and manually added to have a leaderboard, it falls on site management to create the boards. In series that have frequent releases, or games like Roblox that have an endless number of fan games to play, the site may decide to appoint series mods to create boards for them. The site also has a super moderator role. In addition to all the regular mod permissions, super moderators have the ability to add or remove staff for their game, so that speedrun.com staff does not need to handle all moderation changes. Now if you've made it this far, how about you verify that you hit that subscribe button and moderate liking the video? The politics of speedrunning is not a straightforward answer. There are an ever-growing number of communities, each presenting the possibility to further experiment and refine approaches on how to best run a society. For everything done right and everything done wrong, each is an opportunity to learn and improve. Regardless, thanks and see you again soon.